The first light of dawn spilled over the Montana forest as Frank Miller, a weathered carpenter in his 70s, opened the cabin door. His breath froze in the sharp air, but what froze him more was the sight before him. On the porch rail sat Juno, a wild bobcat, her golden eyes locked on him with unsettling calm. At her paws, a tiny kitten wobbled on unsteady legs, mewing softly. Buddy, Frank's old hunting dog, stiffened and growled, yet the bobcat didn't retreat. Instead, Juno flicked her tail once and nudged the fragile creature forward. Frank's pulse thundered as he realized he was being tested. He had expected solitude in this remote place, not a visitor from the wild. In that frozen moment, the silence of the forest felt alive, charged with a question. Would he reject this offering or let something extraordinary begin? Buddy's growl deepened, a low rumble echoing across the porch. Frank steadied the old dog with a hand, his heart hammering at the weight of what he was witnessing. Juno did not bare her teeth, nor did she flinch. Her posture remained upright, her stare unwavering, as though she was studying his soul. The kitten mewed again, stumbling against the wooden rail, and Frank's throat tightened. For decades, he had lived alone in the cabin he built with his own hands. He had faced storms, winters, and the slow silence of age, but nothing had ever pierced his heart like this. Juno turned her head, her ears twitching to the wind, and then, without sound, she slipped into the tree line, leaving the kitten on the boards. Frank knelt, trembling, his breath sharp with awe. In that moment, he knew his life had shifted forever. Frank carried the fragile kitten inside, wrapping it in a ragged wool blanket near the stove. Its fur was damp, its body trembling, and its tiny heartbeat fluttered like a trapped bird. Buddy paced nervously, unsure if the intruder was friend or foe. Frank lowered himself into his old rocker, every joint aching, and stared into the firelight. Juno's golden eyes lingered in his mind, not hostile, not fearful, but deliberate. Why had she chosen him? Why had she trusted an old man on the edge of his days with something so precious? Outside, the storm-worn forest stood silent, its pines looming like sentinels. Inside, the small creature whimpered once, then curled into sleep against the warmth of the embers. Frank realized he was no longer just a man living alone in a cabin. He had become part of a story far larger than himself. That night stretched long and sleepless. Frank sat by the stove, listening to the soft whimpers of the kitten, its breaths uneven but persistent. Buddy settled finally at his feet, his eyes half open, still watchful. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, carrying with it the restless hush of the timber. Each time the fire cracked, Frank's mind returned to the bobcat mother. She had not abandoned her young, she had entrusted it. That thought gnawed at him, filled him with both awe and responsibility. The cabin, once echoing with emptiness, now hummed with fragile life. As dawn crept in, pale and cold, Frank opened the door to the yard. Frost gleamed across the porch. In the whitened boards, clear as ink, lay fresh paw prints circling his cabin. Juno had returned under the cover of night, watching unseen, guarding the child she had placed with him. The rehook came with a chill sharper than the morning frost. The tracks were not passing by. They circled, deliberate, pacing. Frank crouched, his knees aching, tracing the crescent-shaped imprints pressed into the wood. Juno had been close enough to listen to the kitten's cries through the walls, close enough to hear Buddy's restless groans. His chest tightened at the realization that his cabin had become part of her boundary, her chosen refuge. He poured himself a steaming mug of coffee, his hands trembling, and stood at the window. Beyond the spruce shadows, he imagined her golden eyes fixed on him. The kitten stirred, letting out a weak sound, and Buddy lifted his head, ears twitching toward the door. Frank's pulse quickened. The wild wasn't leaving him behind. It was pressing closer, step by step, demanding to know if he was worthy of the trust. At dusk, Frank's breath caught as Juno emerged again from the shadows. This time, she carried another kitten delicately in her jaws. The snow crunched faintly as she crossed the yard, her muscles fluid and deliberate. She approached the porch, her gaze never leaving Frank. With a soft nudge, she set the second kitten on the boards and stepped back, her ears flicking. The tiny creature squeaked, tumbling awkwardly against its sibling already inside. Buddy whined, caught between instinct and bewilderment. Frank stood frozen, awe surging through him. This was no accident, no fleeting encounter. It was choice. Juno was choosing him, weaving him into her family's survival. For a long moment, man, dog, and wildcat remained in a fragile circle of silence. Then, Juno slipped back into the timber, leaving behind the weight of her decision. Frank knew this was only the beginning.
The cabin glowed with firelight, but Frank's eyes stayed fixed on the window where Juno had vanished. Two kittens now stirred on the folded blanket near the hearth, their small bodies rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Buddy lay close, watchful, his tail thumping uneasily against the boards. Frank sipped cooling coffee, his hands trembling with the enormity of what had just unfolded. Never in his 70 years had he witnessed such deliberate trust from the wild. He thought of the warnings townsfolk often shared about predators, about danger, about boundaries never meant to be crossed. Yet here he was, chosen. He pressed his palm against the window frame, gazing into the dark where golden eyes might still watch from the tree line. The silence outside was no longer empty. It carried the weight of a pact, unspoken, fragile, but undeniable. The fragile calm shattered when Mary Whitaker's old truck rumbled up the gravel road the next afternoon. Mary, his neighbor, a mile down, sharp-eyed and practical, stepped out with her usual briskness. Her gaze swept the porch, her expression tightening when she spotted the faint paw prints in the frost. Inside, the faint mews of the kittens carried through the cabin walls. Mary's lips pressed into a thin line as she looked at Frank with a mixture of disbelief and fear. She scolded him for inviting danger, warned him that wild animals were unpredictable, and muttered about insurance and liability. Frank listened, the words pressing heavy against his chest. Yet his eyes drifted to the blanket by the stove. The tiny creatures stirred in the warmth, oblivious to human fears. For the first time in years, he felt his solitude cracking open into something alive.
After Mary left, her warnings echoed in the cabin, but Frank could not shake the pull of what was happening. He sat in his chair as the firelight flickered across the log walls, listening to the soft breaths of the kittens. Buddy shifted restlessly, catching scents beyond the door, as if sensing that the wild had stitched itself permanently into their lives. Frank's thoughts tangled between caution and wonder. He had known loneliness for too many winters, his days reduced to chores and silence. Yet now, with two wild lives pressed into his care, he felt the thrum of belonging return. Outside, the pines creaked in the evening wind, shadows stretching long across the snow. He looked toward the tree line, half expecting golden eyes to appear once more. He knew Juno had not finished. This was not abandonment. It was the slow forging of trust. That night, as the fire burned low, Frank opened the cabin door to a yard washed in silver moonlight. The forest stood still, draped in frost, the silence heavy with anticipation. Then he saw her. Juno lingered at the tree line, her body poised, tail lashing once, her eyes burning gold against the dark. She did not advance, nor did she retreat. Instead, she stood as though measuring him once more, testing the fragile pact between them. The kittens stirred inside, their faint cries floating into the night. Juno flicked an ear toward the sound, then returned her gaze to Frank. For a moment, time held its breath. Then she melted into the shadows without sound, leaving only her prints etched in the snow. Frank closed the door, his chest tight. The wild had chosen him, and whether he was ready or not, there was no turning back.
The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of winter light that sharpens every edge of the world. Frank stepped onto the porch with his coffee, scanning the tree line. His heart clenched when he saw Juno again, her silhouette framed against the rising sun. But this time, she didn't remain at the edge. She turned deliberately, slipping into the woods, pausing to glance back. It was no random visit. She was calling him. Frank's pulse quickened as Buddy whined uneasily, his tail stiff. Together they followed her path through pines heavy with frost. Each step carried them deeper, past places Frank hadn't wandered in years. At last, Juno led them into a ravine choked with ferns and shadow. And there, nestled among rocks, lay 3 more kittens. Tiny, fragile, their eyes barely open, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Frank's chest tightened. Juno had revealed her most guarded secret. The air in the ravine was heavy, every sound muffled by layers of pine needles. Frank crouched slowly, his old knees protesting as he pressed his hands into the damp earth. The 3 kittens squirmed weakly, their tiny mews blending with the hush of the forest. Juno stood nearby, her golden eyes locked on him, her muscles taut, but not aggressive. It was a test, plain and simple. She was showing him what no human was meant to see: her den, her heart, her trust. Buddy lay down at Frank's side, his chin against his paws, a gesture of calm that surprised even his master. Frank whispered softly to steady himself, though the words mattered less than the tone. For several long minutes, man, dog, and Bobcat held their fragile circle in silence. In that sacred hush, Frank knew he had been chosen for something rare.
But peace never lingers long. The snap of a branch jolted Frank's heart, his breath catching. Juno's ears twitched, her body coiling with sudden tension. Buddy growled low, his hackles rising. Frank's eyes scanned the ridge above the ravine, expecting a deer or coyote. Instead, a figure emerged: Jack Turner, the local hunter, his rifle slung over one shoulder and a steel trap dangling from his hand. His smirk spread when he saw Frank crouched near the den. His voice carried cold disdain, taunting the old man for babysitting predators. Frank's chest tightened. Jack was reckless, known for his temper and for pushing boundaries in the forest. The trap gleamed in his hand like a threat. The fragile trust Frank had been building now trembled under a far more dangerous shadow. This was no accident. Jack had come here for them, and he wasn't planning to leave empty-handed. The tension thickened, the forest itself holding its breath. Juno crouched low, her tail lashing, her growl rolling like thunder under the trees. Buddy bristled, teeth bared, his body trembling with restrained fury. Frank rose slowly, his cane sinking into the snow, his pulse hammering in his ears. Jack sneered, insisting the Bobcats were dangerous and that Frank's foolishness would get someone killed. The steel trap clanked as he let it fall onto the ground. Frank's voice, though cracked with age, rang steady with defiance. He would not let Jack harm them. For the first time, he felt the weight of Juno's eyes on him,
not as a test, but as recognition. She stood beside him, not against him. For one charged moment, the hunter, the protector, and the wild mother formed a tense triangle of fury, fear, and resolve. The air itself seemed ready to shatter.
Jack's smirk faltered when Juno took a step forward, her growl deepening into something primal. The rifle strap slipped slightly from his shoulder as his hand twitched toward it. Buddy barked sharply, the sound ricocheting off the ravine walls. Frank raised his hand firmly, his voice low but unyielding, warning Jack not to move. The kittens mewed faintly, their cries carrying through the cold air like fragile bells. The sound seemed to slice through the tension, underscoring the raw truth. This was not a fight about danger, but about survival and trust. Jack cursed, his bravado cracking for a moment as he kicked snow over the trap. With a final glare, he slung his rifle back over his shoulder and stormed off, his boots crunching loud into the distance. Silence reclaimed the ravine. Frank's legs trembled, but in his chest burned something fierce. He had stood his ground. The walk back to the cabin felt heavier than any load Frank had carried in his life. Each step echoed with Jack's threat. The image of the steel trap burned into his mind. Buddy stayed close, his head lowered, his eyes darting to every shadow. Juno slipped silently behind them, her golden gaze steady, her body coiled but calm now that the immediate danger had passed. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, and the kittens stirred on their blanket, their tiny paws twitching in sleep. Frank sank into his chair, his chest aching with exhaustion. For years, his life had been measured by routine and solitude. Now it was measured by paw prints in the snow and the fragile weight of trust. He stared into the fire, knowing Jack Turner was not finished. The storm to come would not just be weather, it would be war.
The following days carried a fragile rhythm. Each dawn, Juno returned to the porch, sometimes slipping inside to curl protectively around her kittens, sometimes pacing the tree line in watchful silence. Buddy adjusted reluctantly, his instincts torn, but his loyalty to Frank stronger. Frank, for his part, found himself living between awe and fear. The forest gave no answers, only tests. At night, he dreamed of steel jaws snapping shut, of golden eyes flickering in the dark. By day, he gathered firewood, mended fences, and watched over the fragile family now bound to his home. In town, whispers grew, rumors of a crazy old man keeping predators. Frank ignored them, but he felt their weight. Each time Juno appeared, he reminded himself, the world beyond might never understand, but the wild had chosen him, and that was worth more than approval or safety. Winter tightened its grip. Snow fell heavy and constant, blanketing the yard in silence. Frank stocked supplies, but even as he moved through familiar routines, his thoughts circled Jack Turner. The hunter's cruelty was as sharp as the traps he carried. Frank knew he would return, perhaps when least expected. One night, as wind battered the shutters, Frank heard it, a faint metallic snap outside. His blood ran cold. Buddy bolted to the door, barking furiously. Frank grabbed his flashlight and cane, stepping into the storm. Snow whipped across his face as he followed the sound. At the edge of the yard, half buried in drift, a sprung steel trap lay clamped shut on nothing. The bait, raw meat, dangled from a low branch. Jack had been here, setting snares even in the storm. The fury in Frank's chest burned hotter than the winter fire.
Frank hurled the trap into the ravine with a grunt, the crash swallowed by the storm. The forest pressed close around him, thick with menace. He turned back, snow stinging his cheeks, his breath sharp and ragged. Juno's growl echoed from the cabin, deep and rolling, her body tense as she paced near the door. The kittens squeaked inside, their cries muffled by the storm. Buddy pressed against Frank's leg, his body trembling, but his stance defiant. As Frank stepped inside, Juno locked eyes with him. For a heartbeat, they shared something wordless, an acknowledgement of the danger circling them. The storm outside raged on, but inside, man, dog, and wildcat huddled around fragile life. Frank knew this was only the beginning. Jack's cruelty would not stop. Yet in that storm, in that moment, he also knew that the fragile truce had hardened into an unshakable bond. By dawn, the storm broke, leaving the cabin wrapped in silence. Snow piled high against the porch, sparkling in the first weak rays of sun. The bobcat mother stretched out and slipped outside, her paw prints marking the fresh white canvas like deliberate brushstrokes. The kittens stirred in their crate, pressing against one another, their tiny voices filling the cabin with fragile life. Frank cradled his coffee, staring at the tracks vanishing into the timber. Jack Turner's shadow hung heavy, yet stronger still was the knowledge that Juno had not abandoned him. She had chosen him again, returning despite danger, despite fear. The storm had tested them, but they had endured. As Buddy sighed at his feet and the kittens mewed softly, Frank realized the real trial was still ahead. Trust wasn't just about surviving storms, it was about standing together when the world came crashing down.
The days following the storm carried a deceptive calm. Snow draped the cabin in quiet beauty, but beneath that silence, tension coiled like a hidden snare. In town, whispers thickened into warnings. Farmers muttered about the old fool harboring predators, while hunters speculated how long before tragedy struck. Frank kept to himself, yet each word stung. Juno, however, remained constant. She appeared daily, circling the porch, her golden eyes fixed on Frank with a steady calm. The kittens grew stronger, clumsy paws tumbling across blankets as Buddy watched like a reluctant babysitter. But each evening, as firelight flickered and the wind groaned outside, Frank thought of Jack Turner. He pictured the trap in the snow, the rifle leaning against the tree. He knew Jack wasn't finished. The hunter's pride had been pricked, and pride left unchecked was as dangerous as any storm. The true trial was drawing near. One brittle afternoon, Frank returned from splitting logs to find Mary Whitaker's truck crunching up the drive. She stepped out, her arms crossed, her breath fogging the air. "Half the town's buzzing," she said, eyes narrowing. "Jack's stirring them up. They're talking about calling the ranger." Frank's chest tightened. He led her inside, where the kittens scrambled playfully on the rug. Mary froze, her stern face softening in spite of herself. "Lord help me," she whispered. "They're beautiful." Juno sat calmly nearby, her gaze steady, not hostile. Mary shook her head, muttering about liability, danger, and insurance, but Frank saw the flicker in her eyes. Awe, not just fear. "I'll stand with you," she admitted finally, her voice reluctant but real. For Frank, her words carried weight. For the first time, he wasn't alone against Jack Turner's storm. The circle of protection was widening. That night, the wind died, leaving the forest unnervingly still. Frank sat in his rocker, Buddy at his feet, the kittens curled together like sparks of life. Juno paced outside the porch, her shadow gliding across the snow. Suddenly, Buddy stiffened, ears pricked. A faint crunch echoed from the tree line. Frank's heart pounded. He stepped onto the porch, cane in hand, scanning the darkness. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement too deliberate to be deer. Jack Turner. His rifle slung across his back, his boots leaving a bold trail in the snow. The hunter froze when he saw Frank silhouetted by lantern light. "Evening," Jack drawled, voice dripping with contempt. "Still playing house with wild animals?" Frank's grip tightened on his cane. Behind him, the kittens meowed softly, and from the shadows, Juno's growl rolled like thunder, deep and primal as she stepped into the light. The air snapped taut as Jack smirked, shifting his rifle. "You can't protect them forever, Frank," he spat. "One day they'll tear into you, or worse, someone else.
Better I end this before it starts. Juno crouched low, her muscles rippling under her fur, golden eyes blazing with fury. Buddy snarled, teeth bared, standing shoulder to shoulder with Frank. For a long heartbeat, the three forces of the forest collided: the hunter, the wild mother, and the protector who had been chosen. Jack sneered, his fingers twitching near the trigger. Frank's voice cut through the cold, low and steady. "Not tonight, Jack. Not ever. You'll have to go through me first." The words trembled, but the resolve did not. Juno's growl deepened, vibrating through the ground itself. Jack faltered, sweat beading despite the cold. For the first time, his arrogance cracked into doubt.
Jack's bravado wavered under the weight of eyes that glowed in the dark, not just Juno's, but Buddy's and Frank's steady, unflinching stare. The hunter shifted uneasily, his boots crunching in the snow. "You're a fool," he muttered, though his voice lacked the venom it once carried. The rifle strap slipped slightly, and he caught it clumsily. Frank stepped forward, his cane sinking into the drift, his voice steady. "These woods aren't yours to claim, Jack. They never were. You see predators. I see trust." Juno rose slowly, no longer crouched for battle, but standing tall beside Frank, her tail lashing once like a banner. The kitten's faint cries drifted from the cabin, a reminder of what truly hung in the balance. Jack cursed under his breath, then kicked snow over the trap at his feet. "This isn't over," he spat, before stomping back into the trees. Silence settled heavy once Jack's footsteps faded into the forest. Frank exhaled slowly, his chest aching with both relief and fury. Juno relaxed her stance, padding closer, her eyes softening as they met his. For the first time, she brushed against his leg, a fleeting touch, deliberate, acknowledging him not as intruder, but as ally. Buddy wagged his tail once, still bristling but calmer now. Inside, the kittens squealed, tumbling against each other, blissfully unaware of the battle just fought on their behalf. Frank sank onto the porch steps, the cold biting into his bones. For years, he had thought his life small, reduced to coffee mugs and creaking joints. Yet here he was, holding a line against a hunter, standing beside a wild mother. He realized then, this wasn't just about survival. It was about family. A family forged in trust, not blood.
News of the confrontation spread quickly in town. Jack Turner's pride painted Frank as reckless, a stubborn fool harboring danger. But others whispered with wonder about the wild bobcat who returned daily, choosing an old man's porch over the deep woods. Frank ignored the chatter. His cabin was no longer a lonely place. It was alive. The kittens grew bolder, darting across the rug, climbing the firewood stack, tumbling over Buddy's kale. Juno watched with serene vigilance, her presence filling the cabin like a silent guardian. Even Mary softened, visiting often with blankets, food, and quiet words of support. Yet Frank knew the world outside would never understand. They saw risk, he saw purpose. And in the glow of the fire, with wildness pressed against his hearth, Frank realized he no longer cared about whispers or warnings. The forest had chosen him, and that was enough. One evening, as snow melted into spring's first thaw, the kittens scrambled onto the porch for the first time. Their clumsy paws slipped on damp boards, their squeaks filling the twilight air. Juno sat proudly nearby, her golden eyes glowing as she watched them explore. Buddy tolerated their antics with a sigh, though his tail wagged whenever one nuzzled his nose. Frank leaned on the railing, his chest swelling with quiet pride. This unlikely family, man, dog, wildcat, and kittens, had grown against every odd. In that golden light, he thought of his late wife, of long-lost laughter once echoing in these walls.
Now, in the mewls of Kittens and the quiet trust of Juno, he felt it again. He whispered softly, "You brought me back to life." Juno blinked slow and steady, a gesture of peace. In that moment, he knew he had been accepted.
By the time spring fully claimed the valley, the kittens had grown strong and bold. They darted through tall grass, their spotted coats flashing in the sun, their playful growls ringing like small drums. Frank sat on the porch, his old rocker creaking beneath him, watching with awe. Juno leapt gracefully onto the railing, her tail flicking as she scanned the horizon. She no longer hovered on the edge of fear. She belonged. Buddy sprawled lazily at Frank's feet, content in his unlikely role as babysitter. Mary stopped by with pie one afternoon, chuckling softly at the sight. "You've built something here, Frank," she admitted. "Something I never thought I'd see." Frank smiled faintly. He didn't need the town's approval. The wild had given him something better: family, belonging, purpose. And as the sun dipped low, the cabin no longer felt lonely. It felt whole. The final test came not with claws or rifles, but with stillness. One morning, Frank stepped outside to find Juno waiting on the porch rail, her gaze softer than ever. The kittens played in the yard, tumbling in sunlight. Buddy sat close, his muzzle gray, his eyes warm. Frank lowered himself into his chair, coffee steaming in his hands, and felt the weight of a life transformed. Juno leapt down, brushing briefly against his knee before settling in the grass beside her young. That fleeting touch was not a test. It was acceptance. In that moment, Frank realized he was no longer just a caretaker of kittens or a foolish old man in town's eyes. He was part of a story written in paw prints and trust, in growls and quiet blinks. For the first time in years, his heart whispered with certainty, he was not alone.